Good. All right. Thanks to all of you who are here in person for our talk, and for those of you on Zoom who are also joining us. It's my pleasure, great pleasure, really, to introduce today's speakers. The first speaker and the main speaker who will be talking about some themes from her new book, Cancer Wars, is Dr. Sigal Ben-Porath from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Ben-Porath is an expert on issues of free speech on campus and has consulted with a number of universities on issues around polarization and the cancer wars. She's a professor at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, and also a member of the Philosophy and Political Science departments, and a fellow at the Institute for Law and Philosophy there as well. I'm not going to go through all of her publications. They're plentiful, but as I said, she'll be talking about themes from her new book, Cancer Wars, and also linked pretty closely to her previous book on free speech on campus. She's published widely on issues in the philosophy of education. So I'm going to turn it over to Sigal. Thank you very much for joining us, Sigal.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you and Dave and Vivek for the kind invitation. I'm very excited to be here. It's beautiful outside, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'm sorry that I'm speaking in English. I do feel self-conscious about that. I did grow up in France, and I do speak French, but not as good as, not as fluently as English. And also, whenever I'm in a Francophone context, it brings back memories of growing up with the name Sigal. In France, it's not a very good name. It doesn't work. So, La Cigale et la Fourmi is that's everyone's response when I was little, when they were hearing my name. So anyway, so I'm going to stick to English with apologies. So this new book that I wrote is really, as Kevin was saying, an effort to situate my earlier work on campus free speech, and also the various struggles over free speech, both on college campuses and increasingly in schools as well, to situate those within the broader democratic context. So really to think about what it is about the current democratic moment that exacerbates the current tensions around free speech, and what it is in those tensions that really reflects or explicates some of these democratic tensions. So, okay, let's see if we manage to make this work. No, okay. So, so first off, I just want to situate the issues that I want to talk about within the current context. Just really getting started. So that's, yeah, no worries at all. You didn't miss anything. So to situate, yeah, go ahead, Dave. Yeah, please.
Not quite working as a vehicle.
Okay.
We're just going to fix that.
No problem. If you want, we can stop the sharing. I think, yeah.
You might have to just show the PowerPoint. That's what happened the last Sunday. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Oh, there is Bruce. He wants to get in. I'm gonna let him in. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Is this better for the Zoom purpose? Let me know what you'd like me to do.
Let's make sure that it actually works. No. So it's not.
Is it still shared from my,
Wondering.
let's see, hold on for 1 second. What if I go into the Zoom?
Like, just leave it like this, Sigal, if you don't mind, leave it like this and then
Yeah.
move within PowerPoint without having to change the
Oh,
slide.
without sharing it?
Yeah,
So
without
can
going to slide, just click on 2 or 3. You see?
you make it then
I can make it
the
bigger.
full,
I can make it bigger for you.
screen?
Yep.
Oh, you can stop share. I am screen sharing, so.
So that's
if-
good. That's good. The
It
fact
is.
that your screen sharing is good, and we just want to make this bigger for you. Because what this happened the last time for us, sorry.
No, that's okay.
So just when you need to move to the next slide, click on it here,
Oh, okay.
and that way people can see it. Is that good, Dave?
Yeah, that's. Let's try switching slides.
How is this?
That looks like it worked.
Okay. Okay, here I am restarting the spiel. Okay, so I do want to say I gave a talk a few years back at the University of Pittsburgh where there was a really big audience and the screen didn't work at all. So I had to constantly say, well, if you could see my slide, you would have seen. So this is actually easier. So, okay. So basically in the US, in the current moment, we are seeing significant struggles over what schools, which I'm going to focus on, and universities as well, which I'm going to gesture towards, are able to talk about. And so if you see here, we really started off with fighting over COVID measures in the current round. Obviously, it's not brand new, but the current round started off with people who disbelieve in, don't believe that COVID is an actual illness, or don't believe that the masks are working, or that the government can require vaccines, etc. And from there, really the move was fairly quick and smooth into fighting over the general issues, as you can see up there: education, not indoctrination. Okay, define either of those so we can talk about that. And significantly, a fight over 2 core things. One is race, how to talk about race, what to teach about race, how to discuss racism in American history, right? That's really a core issue. What kind of characters you may have in a picture books? Can they be Black, for example? Very scary for some people. So, and can you talk in ways that, so that was just for, not seriously, obviously, but the serious part of the question is whether you can talk about systemic concerns regarding racism and racial inequality, particularly what people generally or broadly title as CRT, or critical race theory. And you see that some people demand that we stop teaching racism, meaning not to teach that racial inequities are systemic, and other people demand that the bans on CRT would be lifted. So that's one topic. And the other topic really is focusing on LGBTQ rights broadly, and on transgender students specifically, or transgender identities specifically, and whether it's legitimate to talk to students about trans rights, whether it's, appropriate for elementary school or for high school or not at all. What are the proper measures for inclusion for transgender folks, etc. So these are really the battle lines that we are seeing this struggle over. And now what I want to do is to take a step back and talk about how some of these things are arising again in this current round of the cancel wars. And then, of course, because I'm an eternal optimist, come on in. We'll talk about what we might be able to do about that. Dave, are we still happy with the slides and things? Yeah, okay, good. Let's see, because I have links now, so we'll see if those work. So The real core issue that we are seeing right now affecting or exacerbating, as I said, these matters is the increasing levels of polarization. And there is tons of research on that. I'm really just giving you a quick sort of like look at that. Many democracies, it's evident in Canada as well, and in various countries in Europe and beyond, many democracies are becoming more polarized. And there's a lot of documentation to that. Both elites, or in other words, elected officials, politicians, are polarizing, right? So we are seeing their policy positions increasingly moving to the sides of issues, moving more extremely, and the public is polarizing as well. So people are voting in ways that push the politicians. There's a big fight in the literature over whether it's the politicians moving the publics to the sides or whether the public is really pushing politicians to become more extreme. Regardless, I'm not going to go into that. Both of them are polarizing, whoever started it. And polarization, while it is asymmetric, right? Let's try and see if this is going to work for us, Dave. No, it's not going to work for us. So you're going to live without my graphs. They are fancy, but you'll survive without. So I'm sorry. Right. It's like this. So so polarization is asymmetric in the sense that we are seeing polarization starting earlier on the right and going further on the right, okay? But we are seeing it on both sides of the political map. That's the last time I'm going to say both sides. Both sides of the political map, right? So really both the left and the right are polarizing. And the more they are polarizing, the more positions are becoming unified within each side. So people, individuals, both politicians and voters are moving to align their views with the new party orthodoxy, right? Wherever the party is, more people are just flocking over there in terms of their policy positions. Oh, right now we all have to have this view. Here we go, we are aligning with that view. And so what we are increasingly seeing is really this, you know, two-hump camel. I come from the Middle East, so that's my metaphoric brain speaking here. But you're right, you're seeing two narrower sets of views to the sides and the pretty big desert in the middle. And this is affecting people's national views, and it's also affecting provincial or state level and local views. And this is most significant in the domain of education. This story about polarization is really, as I said, that's really like a summary of the key literature on that, but what current literature, but what I really care most about and worry most about is an issue that researchers call affective polarization, or sometimes slightly more dramatically, ideological contempt, right? So this really is a little picture that I wanted to see, but I'll tell you about it, never mind. So we are increasingly having negative assumptions about members of the outgroup, meaning people who vote differently from us, or people on the other side of the ideological divide. Let's say that generally progressive are over here and conservatives are over here, or in the US, Democrats and Republicans. If you are not on my side, right? If people are not, for a person who's on the other side, we increasingly have views that depict them as unintelligent, acting in bad faith, morally corrupt, lazy, right? So untrustworthy. So in any surveys that we are seeing about your perspective on people on the other side of the political divide, more and more, and this is really, okay, here's my depiction of the slide, slide that you're missing out on. More and more, we are seeing that everyone's views on the right and the left is becoming quite negative about people on the other side. And this is creating reduced trust, reduced perceptions of good faith, and a reduced goodwill towards the outgroup, meaning that we really have no interest in looking for ways to work across the aisle, to develop shared policy ideas that we can together enact. Increasingly, we prefer to maintain a distance from people who are on the other side, distance geographic, physical, right? So we don't want them to be our neighbors. We don't want them to be our friends. We don't want to share, you know, a meal with them, oftentimes, even if they are our family members. And I mean, in colleges, we are seeing more and more, we don't want to share dorm room with them. Like, that's how they vote. It's like definitely not good for me to be in the same room with them. And so the demand for distance, which is being enacted in, for example, residential decisions, friends groups, and other contexts, is really creating this clear sort of like, you can see how people group themselves by political views. And again, this space in the middle that limits our capacity to work together. And increasingly, because the people that we do associate ourselves with are people who are like us in these senses, right? People who think or vote like us. Increasingly, we demand of them that they fall in line, right? That they adhere by the views that are accepted within our group. We're not like them. We all think this, right? And so there is more and more of a coalescing within each group in order to signify the distance from the other group, the difference from the other group. Okay, and this affective polarization is the core, in my view, concern for the purpose of our discussion. This concern is pointing at the fissures that are growing within the social foundations of our democratic order. The social foundations, as distinct from the institutional foundations or the procedural foundations, right? So democracy has all sorts of things that it needs in order to function. But one of these things is at least a minimal sense of shared trust, which is built, I would like to argue, on these two domains. One of them is the epistemic domain, or the domain of knowledge. And the other one is the sense of boundaries that are delineating sort of like who belongs in our society, the domain of inclusion or belonging. So let me say a few words about these. In terms of knowledge, because, I mean, you know, or truth, right? Because we are significantly getting our information and our, you know, our news, other information about social context. Increasingly, we are getting those from diverse sources, whether they are news sources, you know, official ones that are ideologically aligned, or whether those are more networks of social media of various sorts, or in various countries, WhatsApp groups, right? So groups that share information in various ways. Those are very significant sources of information, not so much in North America, but in various other countries, because we are really situated in these distinct information bubbles, right? And so our information is really distinct across the ideology or within the ideological divide, then our ability to have the same information that is required for us in order to make policy decisions together, that ability is increasingly reduced or diminished. Moreover, so that's sort of like the basic level, right? What is a fact for you and what is a fact for me might be completely different. Our facts, our reality is distinct. In addition to that, we increasingly disagree on evidentiary practices. In other words, what would I need in order to believe a certain truth? What would be a good evidence that you can provide me to show me that what you are saying is actually true? The whole trend of do your own research, right? That is, a little depressing to me, but obviously as an academic, I'm not a good source of information about that, because of course, I would like people to listen to my research or, to what I view as serious research, but some people view that as biased in itself, right? So the evidentiary practices are distinct. And the question, that's the last one, the last layer, of who gets to be an arbiter, who gets to adjudicate disagreements about evidentiary practices or about facts. Who gets to decide? Is it the courts? Is it academia? Of course not. Is it science? Oh, science, like the scientists are just paid by big pharma. I mean, so increasingly, we are sometimes, so increasingly, right? What are the facts? What is an evidence? And who gets to decide? All three of these layers are under dispute, right? And so that really creates a significant erosion in our shared epistemic foundations or the shared knowledge that we really need in order to make decisions that are affecting all of us, right? I mean, in the US, right? I mean, who won the last election, right? It's still an open question for a lot of people, right? Can't the court decide? Of course not. Can, election officials at the local level look at the actual ballots? No, they are, right? So more and more, it's hard to know how you can come out of this sort of like epistemic conundrum. That's one part of it. The other part that I think is already evident even from the battle lines that I showed you all at the beginning is really that we increasingly are failing to reach an agreement or to hold on to an agreement about who belongs and who gets to speak as a accepted and also equal member of both broader society, let's say Canadian society, American society, or a specific community, let's say the Faculty of Law or the Faculty of Education, right? So who is a member in good standing that should be listened to and should be able to share their views? And we saw earlier the disagreements over race and gender. Those are significantly illustrative of the effort to decide who belongs, to delineate, right? Who gets to speak, right? Who is somebody that has a standing, whose perspective we should value, listen to, appreciate, take into account when, as I said, we are making democratic shared decisions that affect all of us. Disagreement about who is included and who belongs really, I think, are reflective of epistemic disagreement about who gets to share their knowledge in a way that is viewed as reasonably relevant and deserves to be taken into account. Okay, so To summarize so far, because I'm depressing you a little bit, I'm going to talk about schools in a moment, and then I'll talk about solutions as well. So just to be clear that I do have some constructive plan in mind for this afternoon. To summarize so far, the cancel wars, as I understand them, really are disagreements about these areas of truth and inclusion in the way that I just depicted. They generate a very narrow sense of agency, right? So my area where I can operate is really just within my immediate vicinity, because I am not trusting of institutions, or increasingly mistrustful of institutions and of others in my society, right? But I urgently have to share my views. I urgently have to try and either impose, or at least make sure that I take a stand about the perspectives that I think are correct and true, as opposed to those other ones that are necessarily bad faith and inappropriate. This reduced trust really favors, as I said, personal action. It favors my ability to act either alone or with people in my immediate group who I trust. And we are seeing schools and colleges, that's the focus for me here, as flashpoints for these disagreements. They're not the only ones, right? So for example, courts are another one right now, election offices, right? So we have various areas, and I'm going to focus on schools because, of course, I think they are the most important ones, but also because I think they are the places where we can find some of our solutions. Okay. So the impact on schools in the US, let me focus on the US for a moment for this purpose, has been really dramatic. We're seeing in just a explosion of new laws that are restricting what teachers may talk about and do in schools. The most I don't know, the most sad one for me are the book bans. This is a library in an elementary school in Florida. A third of the counties in Florida by now have taken away all the books from school libraries and from classrooms, and children are not allowed to bring books from home because they might not be permissible based on the new laws that do not allow to speak about race in picture books. So it's all grades, right? In any books, to talk about race in ways that might cause somebody to feel uncomfortable, mostly worrying about the white children who might feel uncomfortable as a result of discussions of slavery or other histories or current realities. And as noted, books about gender identity. Somebody has two moms or two dads, or somebody has a shift or realizations regarding their own gender identity. All of these are completely impermissible in Florida and about a dozen other states. And so no books are allowed. We are seeing polarized views about schools, which create increased engagement. So for example, the level of voting for school boards, which used to be at best 15%, is now close to 50. So, I love that. I mean, I want people to vote, but it is, unfortunate to see the level of tolerance, a reduced level of tolerance that's coming with that as part of what some people call the school board wars. And we are seeing, as noted, significant struggles over the boundaries of what teachers might say and increasingly what students might say in class, which, of course, for some teachers creates the condition where they are deciding not to say anything about controversial topics and not to let children speak at all, lest they say something inappropriate. By these measures, right? The chilled speech or the environment of reduced opportunity to speak is really reducing the opportunity that children have to be exposed to different ideas. And it's also, of course, we are seeing really a significant rise in teachers being fired, librarians, school leaders being fired for offenses against these laws, and then just preferring not to speak as a result. This for me is the biggest concern. There are other concerns that I just want to note, and they exist. I think they are less pressing, but they surely deserve attention as well. For example, as a result of the demand for adherence to, the party orthodoxy, we do see in various contexts, the teacher would not permit or would prefer not to support speech that doesn't align with her, or the students would demand from each other that they don't say something that doesn't align with their or the majority in the classroom view. So in more conservative areas, you can say something progressive, and in more progressive areas, you may not say something more conservative. And this sort of like social censorship is surely a concern as well, though I do want to say, free the books, right? So, I mean, the laws are a bigger concern to me. Okay, what can we do and how can we act against this in schools? Firstly, I think depolarizing has to focus on the notion of knowledge and truth, which really is the core mission both of K-12 and higher education institution. So if the two areas where we are most concerned about, polarization, as I said, is a knowledge and inclusion, these are the two areas that schools have focused on in order to depolarize. So in the area of knowledge, really, I mean, none of this is like a huge, big new invention that nobody thought about. It's a really sort of like focusing on a core good pedagogical practices and the core missions of schools, and insisting on sustaining them through this period, right? So talking with students about norms of speech in the classroom. What can we say? What can't we say? Discussing evidentiary practices in the same way that we talk about the scientific methods. There are other areas, right, that are not science where you can also discuss these matters, and that would be a productive conversation. Significantly, as many countries are doing, but not so much North American countries, focusing on misinformation, disinformation, and the processes of recruitment for extremist ideologies online, in video game communities, in various platforms that present one sort of like front and then lure young people, particularly young white men, towards extremist ideologies, looking at these and teaching students to resist them. In addition, in the area of belonging, again, nothing that isn't unfamiliar, even in elementary schools. Who currently lives in our society? What communities are, belong here? What communities are currently present here? What can we know about them? What are the political institutions in our country, and how can we affect them? How can we push for change? So all of these are basic democratic and political practices that we have to reiterate and develop habits of democracy to support them. I really think, and I'm happy to talk about that, but when we talk about civic education and developing the habits of democracy, which is a big topic in some areas of education, really focusing on our capacity for saying our perspective and listening to other people's perspectives is something we learn in, like preschool, if we have a nice teacher, You say something and you listen to the next person. And this is something that can grow with us and really can create a sustained commitment to democracy. Okay, now I'm gonna need help with, let's see, maybe I won't, no. So that, okay, I can do that. Okay, and then finally, in terms of depolarizing in the K-12 context, creating the democratic or public conditions in which public schools can sustain themselves and continue to operate. Democracy has to be born anew in every generation, and education is its midwife, right? And so we have to create intentional public support for this work from teachers, because teachers can't do it themselves. They are, as I said, increasingly being fired for actions that they are taken. They are increasingly seeing how they are not supported by the public, and we have to create the conditions where school can be supportive of them. Of course, and I said I will gesture towards colleges. This is me doing that. We are seeing similar processes both within colleges, right? Increased engagement, not always in the most productive way, but increased engagement, reduced trust in the college as an institution and in institutions more broadly, reduced tolerance, etc. And really failing to recognize the ways in which learning communities are built on the notion that everyone needs to be heard, even when they are wrong, right? Because when they say something wrong, it's an opportunity for people listening to them to be able to reflect on that, develop argument why this is actually wrong. You know, so I'm not saying every wrong thing has a place in every learning community every day, right? That would be pretty, you know, poor use of our time. But broadly speaking, broad boundaries for speech, including misguided speech, and at least in the US, although not so much here, hate-based speech, which is protected over there south of the border. All of these are opportunities to think about our differences and to be able to argue, sometimes to try to persuade, and sometimes just to better understand ourselves. Okay, so the search for common ground really is, that's me concluding my talk. The search for common ground really is at the heart of these efforts. And note that I'm saying a common ground rather than middle ground. The middle ground, as I said, is pretty deserted. You know, the middle is pretty empty right now. What we need to look for is places where we can figure out answers to these questions. What do we share, right? Are there any value commitments, any goals, policies, beliefs that we share across difference? What do we know? Are there parts of our epistemic foundations that are still shared across our differences? Okay, maybe COVID exists, maybe it doesn't exist. Can we get, for example, I mean, it does, but you know. So I mean, I don't think these two beliefs are, you know, have the same force. Right? One of them is wrong and the other one is right, but there are a lot of people who believe that one. So what part of knowledge do we share if this part is not shared? What do we want to know, right? And this is really, for me, the main question for any learning community at any level. Kevin was telling me earlier today about a student from a long time ago who shared in class he's right, I think it was a guy, his personal family's history, membership in the Ku Klux Klan. And so, and the student was feeling pretty great about that. You know, so there's obviously, right, sharing a perspective that is, at least in, you know, in its core message is hate-based, right? It's a hateful to words. especially African Americans, but also other groups. What can we do about that? I really want to suggest that the best response to this kind of sharing of divergent opinion is the following request. Tell me more, right? Tell me more. Tell me more. What is it about your family history that you would like for us to know? It doesn't mean that I'm endorsing the Klan now or seeing it as a part of the acceptable set of beliefs, you know, that I want to promote. But here you are in my class, and that's your view. I want to understand. How can I understand you better? In this case, for the purpose of trying to dissuade you, right? That's not always going to be the case, but in this case, it is. What do we want to know in a way that would increase our capacity to think together? And what kind of opportunities do we have to develop the kind of trust that we need in order to continue our democratic practices forward? Okay, so this is the tail end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening, especially through some technological struggles here. And I look forward to hearing Daniel Weinstock's response and then your questions. Thank you. Dave, would you like me to stop sharing, or is it good to just keep it this way? You'll figure it out. Okay.
So thank you very much to Kevin and to the other organizers for having invited me to come and sort of get the conversation going. I'm in a very difficult position because I don't have a paper or anything like that. My brief was to respond to what Sigal was going to say. So I listened and actually read her book, and Sigal and I were trying to figure out how long we've known each other, and we kind of stopped trying to figure it out because it was getting a little bit depressing, but we've known each other for a very long time, and it's a pleasure to see her again. So the difficulty with the brief is, first of all, that we're both philosophers of some kind, and so the first thing you do is, okay, I'm going to find the flaw in the argument. I'm going to spend my time kind of, friendly. I'm going to say it's a friendly amendment, and really it's going to show. But there's really nothing in what Sigal said that I disagree with. So, but that is too short, probably a response for the sake of the organizers. Yeah. So I'm going to, I think Sigal and I, although we've spoken a lot over the years, and we find ourselves sometimes in similar publications, even, we have a different perspective in that I'm not a philosopher of education in any real sense. I'm a political philosopher who's interested in schools, primarily universities, as political institutions. Right. And so I guess, and I think that's it's a subtle but importantly different focus from the focus of philosophers' education. Because I think there's something about political philosophy, not all political philosophy, but certainly the political philosophy that I've become more interested in. People talk about, there's a distinction in political philosophy, I don't know whether it's made its way into philosophy of education, between what people call ideal theory on the one hand and non-ideal theory on the other. Ideal theory is a sort of thing when you sort of think, let's imagine we're starting a new country from scratch, right? And what are the principles that we would want to enact, and what would it look like without any constraints about the real world? And non-ideal theory kind of brings the real world in. And for me, one of the questions that I've become kind of almost obsessed with is, how do we get from here to there, right? How do we get from here to there, given path dependency, given the fact of how much weight, right, the here-ness of here sort of bears upon our choices going forward. And I think it's a very different question because it maybe even limits the sense in which there's a there that is available, right? There might be a there that you would think of in ideal theory as being a destination. And once you realize where you are, maybe you have more modest intentions. So Sigal is also talking as, well, not an American. I don't think I knew about the French part of your life. By the way, McGill is an Anglophone institution, so you didn't have to apologize. Yeah. Sigal is a lovely bird, by the way. I think Sigal in French is lovely. So another difference is that Sigal, though she's Israeli by origin, having lived in France, has spent most of her career, I think it's fair to say, in the United States. And a lot of the data that she brings us is American data. Obviously we're here in Canada, and there's no expectation on Sigal's part that she would know anything in Canada. And, I'd like to be able to stand here and report to you that, of course, what's happening south of the border is, the sort of, the crazy Americans. And we're obviously sort of freed of that. But I think we're actually, the situation, I think I'm going to speak about Quebec. I don't know much about the rest of Canada, as Sigal may not know. Education is a jealously guarded provincial jurisdiction, and in this province, jealously guarded to the nth degree. And so, really talk about Quebec. I think that in a way, there is the hopefulness in your talk, I think was very much expressed in the number of times, I stopped counting, where you talked about what we have to do, right? What we have to do. And I'd like to really sort of reflect on the political agency and what is possible given the circumstances. So the situation in Quebec is one in which education, I think, has already been politicized, maybe even for the kinds of problems with variance that you talk about in your talk. I think we could have told a story starting further back in Quebec history because of the kind of situation, the conflicts that over language, over rival conceptions of the very history of this place, right? What happened? Who's at fault? This is the place of Indigenous peoples. This is a place that sees itself, the majority sees itself as, in a sense, having been colonized. And here are these other people who say, hey, wait a minute, kind of forgotten about the fact that, from our perspective, a lot of your squabbles are between colonial powers, and thank you very much, but we're not interested. So the culture wars in education have started way back. They are now being colored by some of the same problematics that I think you talked about from the US. So the debate now over systemic racism, it's as far as the government goes, it's a no-no. There's no systemic racism in Quebec, and it certainly shouldn't be taught in the schools. The point is that schools have been instrumentalized for political ends from way back, and there's no sign of it stopping. Just to give you something that I've been involved in a little bit over the course of my career, I was involved in the late 90s in a commission that proposed the creation of we used to have confessional schools in Quebec till not that long ago, right? Schools where people were actually taught to be little Catholics and little Protestants, not little Jews, because we didn't, but the turn away from that led to the creation of a course that existed for about a decade called Ethics and Religious Cultures, where children were taught about the religious environment that they lived in, obviously with an emphasis on the bigger religions around, but got a sense of the religious landscape in a context where Islamophobia post 9/11, and for reasons that are particular to Quebec as well, was really quite a problem and continues to be quite a problem. This course was seen as being a way in which children across Quebec, including in places where there are no Jews or Muslims. I'm pointing over there, but that's not where, we're talking, outside of Montreal, would get a sense of both the diversity of the linguistic landscape around them, but also something about, I think that one of the points that really resonated with me, forgive me if I'm free associating a little bit, but that's sort of the nature of a presentation that's given sort of on the fly on the basis. I think that one of the things that I hoped would happen with this course is that kids would come out of high school curious, rather than having a priori dogmatic, categorical views about other religions. Jews are like that, and Muslims are like this, and Anglicans are like that. That they would come out curious and sort of tell me more. It's not that in a course that's going to be taught for an hour every week, we're going to turn people into religious scholars of Islam and Buddhism and Judaism and Christianity, but at least that they have a sense of it as a viable a way of living that would lead them when they encountered a Jew or a Muslim or to say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more, exactly what you were saying. Now, the point is that I think that in this province, and I suspect in a lot of places, government has less interest in developing that curiosity than it has ever had. The course that I'm talking about was cancelled, right, to use the term advisedly, by the present government, precisely because, again, euphemism is everywhere here. It gives too much time to religion, right? But, it's not giving too much time to religion. It's giving too much time to certain religions. And it's going to be replaced with a course, the nature of which we're still waiting to see. We'll see. The point that I'm trying to make by this kind of long rambling thing is, when I look at some of the earlier stuff that I wrote on kind of political philosophy of education, I was very interested and concerned about equality and inequality in the school system, right? So, we live also in a province that has the most inegalitarian school system in Canada, certainly, probably not in North America, but in Canada. The solution was a very clear one for a political philosopher who was maybe a bit more of an ideal theorist back in the day. And for someone who, maybe back in the day didn't see the state as itself already having been corrupted by the kind of politicization and polarization that we're seeing, was basically state schools, sort of the Eamon Callan sort of ideal of common schools, available to all, of high quality, stop funding private schools where kids sort of ghettoize with one another. And that just seemed like the obvious way, both in which to achieve a certain degree of egalitarianism, right? Everybody gets the same, or kids' education is not determined by the ability of their parents to pay, but also a certain amount of social mixing, common schools, where people come together across lines of class, across lines, we can still say the word class, right? That's what we across lines of class, across lines of ethnocultural identity, across religious lines, and achieve in a kind of unproblematic way the kind of mixing that will lead perhaps to people emerging from this, knowing just because they've done it, not so much maybe in classes, but in the schoolyard, right? What are you eating for lunch? Oh, you can't eat ham. Oh, that's interesting. Why not? Oh, I didn't know that. In the kind of easy way would lead to people emerging from high school with a kind of aptitude for reaching across differences that isn't necessarily born of the classroom, but born of the sort of informal, unwritten curriculum of the schools. That optimism for me is now gone because I think in a lot of places, and certainly the two places that we live in, the state is now part of the problem rather than part of the solution, because it now sees schools as what they've always been, namely a tool for socialization, but therefore, because of that, a tool for political agendas getting pushed, which in the case of this province is a political agenda, which is now sort of flirting with the kinds of problems that you've identified in the United States in terms of, well, I won't repeat what you said. And so the easy answer for me as a political philosopher from 20 years ago, when the situation may not have been as bad, and maybe I was a little bit more of an ideal theorist, and I thought of the state as some kind of ideal Rawlsian thing out there rather than these states, right? The easy solution about political agency, which is we through our political institutions, right, now becomes more difficult to sustain. And so the question, I guess, which I have for you, but which I have for all of us in a way, is if maybe I'm being too pessimistic, right? Maybe we will emerge from this moment of polarization where the political parties that aspire to power are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Maybe we'll emerge from this with some reasonable reclaim the some kind of I don't know. Climb back from polarization. Life is long. We never know where we're going to be in 10 or 15 years. But in the immediate, I wonder for myself, and it's an invitation that I make to all of us, is what is the political agency here that gets us there in a context where schools themselves, as you said, are institutions and the people who work in them are themselves, regardless of their intentions, paralyzed and for fear of dismissal. And they are, after all, you know, instructed to do what the state tells them to do, and were they to, you know, defect from that, you know, put their jobs at risk, and so do what you say they do, which is, you know, basically stay silent. The schools themselves, you know, are again caught in the necessity to sort of implement the curriculum that is decided for them by the state. I mean, so I think somewhere in one of my papers, which I couldn't find as I was rereading stuff to prepare for today, I made a distinction between schools and education, right? That education is something that happens in a lot of different places and not just in the schools. And that there are agencies of education that are families, that are civil society organizations that aren't in the same way under the sort of control of the state of curricula that conduce to the education of children to some degree, to a greater degree. When I think about my kids who are now all adults, and you know how they've turned out and how they've been educated and what the determining impacts on who they are have been, you know, I'm likely to think of schools to some degree, but I'm also likely to think about a lot of civil society organizations that they chose to participate in. You know, things as down to earth, but really life shaping as sports teams, right? Where kids, you know, learn to work with one another. In the case of my kid who was involved in sports, really not so much across religious or ethnocultural lines, but across class lines, to be sure. Across class lines, to be sure, right? I think also of things like artistic pursuits that were, you know, that some of I don't have a million kids, but my 3 kids were involved in, you know, that taught them the kind of curiosity that has become more difficult through the schools. And so I guess so a question, which is, how do you see the political agency that will get the schools to where we want them to be? Because your book, the chapter, certainly chapter 4 of the book, is certainly about K-12 schools, right? And so what do you do if you're in Florida under the rain? I have to say the most terrifying picture I've seen in a long time is that picture that you showed of the library with the books turned so that you can't even see the spines and the tape across them and then closed. It literally physically sent a chill up my spine. I wasn't expecting it. You caught me unawares. I knew it was happening, but somehow that visual was just terrifying, really, something out of 1984. So, you know, what do you do in terms of political agency if you are in Florida under DeSantis? I mean, you know, if you're in my colleague and friend Darren Rosenblum, who's here, we were talking just at lunch about schools in New York, where, you know, the intimation was made that sometimes they might even be too progressive, you know. So, you know, some people maybe get out of jail free card just in virtue of where they're lucky enough to live. But if you're in the other half of the US or this country where you know, schools have been basically locked under an ideological agenda from the state, who is the we that will get the schools there? And my slight sort of, so I've come here to depress you, but you know, the slight sliver of hope is there something to be, should we theorize to a greater degree the potential of those civil society organizations, that even the churches and the synagogues and the mosques that aren't under control of the state, that are still part of the, you know, as perhaps in the immediate, the engines of the kind of agency towards that kind of curiosity and ability to discuss across difference, that the schools for the time being seem to, it's hard to imagine a path forward in places where the state has taken them to the degree that it has as the kind of ideological tools that certainly in this place and in places that you've talked about that it has. So I probably talked for too long, but that's the question that I'd like to hear from you about, is how do we get from this, the very sort of depressing here to there within the schools, and should we be thinking outside of the school context as well? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Daniel and Sigal. I'm just going to sort of offer a procedural note, and then Sigal will have a chance to address Daniel's question. We're doing a hybrid format today, so there's people on Zoom and there are people here in the room. We have plenty of time for questions and answers. And we'll do that. So I guess I'll be moderating sort of just to make sure that everyone who has a question has a chance to ask it here. And Tessa, are you going to be monitoring? So just so everyone knows, we'll be going maybe back and forth between in-person questions and Zoom questions. And I'd ask Daniel and Sigal if the questions are addressed to you, maybe so you can get on camera for the Zoom people can come up in.
Some chairs over there, so
I'll do that. Okay.
and then,
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
You want the rolling one or? No, we don't. You're the guest, so you get the best.
Yeah, there. Okay,
Yeah, we both have
perfect.
fancy ones.
So yes, we both do. Whatever works. Okay, so and you can fix that. So then, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Daniel, for this thoughtful reflection on the presentation and on the book. I want to say that yeah, the distinction between ideal and unideal theory has made it, all the way to the faculties of education and definitely the philosophy of education. And I will say that, I mean, at least the spirit of your concern in this regard has haunted me a little bit, like, is this vision a little Pollyannish, am I saying, oh, let's all just get along, which is, of course, something I aspire for, but it's not really what I'm trying to say here. And definitely, it's not the solution I'm offering, like, get over the big differences. We are all and we can get along. So, I don't necessarily believe that, and I definitely am not trying to make the case for that. What I am trying to say, and I appreciate, the push to try and clarify that, I am trying to say, just as you were saying, that there are important ways in which political agency, and particularly mobilization, right? So shared political agency is our best hope. I'm not saying it's 100% foolproof, but I'm saying it's our best hope. And the way in which it's our best hope is both within and beyond institutions. And the institutions that I think are most promising for me are educational institutions, in ways that I want to, elaborate, particularly in light of the Florida, justified concern that you're raising. Educational institutions, and you are suggesting faith institutions or faith communities as well. In the US, they are significant forces in the other direction, particularly evangelical organizations. But maybe there is promise both in them and in others, right? So I'm not dismissing that at all. I actually think it's promising to think about faith organizations and other social institutions rather than formal or political institutions as tools that can support us in bridging differences as they operate right now, as forces, but also through efforts to create connections across them, right? So okay, but that's really all I have to say about the faith institutions. I want to say something more about political agency. I love forms of resistance that I'm seeing from teachers, classroom teachers, librarians, school leaders in their various, capacities, trying to figure out ways to resist. For example, posting on these, you know, like the you know, the free the books, you know, like the on these required posters that are covering the books, posting on them QR codes to digital libraries, right? So, and we've had numerous cases of that, right? So, you know, here is a way for you as a child, you know, to free the books with your phone or device, right? So this had, you know, somebody figured it out and put the kibosh on that, but, you know, trying to find ways to resist, you know, the silencing. I love it wherever I see. I definitely think it's unjustified to expect it. A lot of people lose their jobs. I mean, you know, it's a tough call what you want to do. Do you want to keep being a teacher when you're not allowed to speak about any of these issues? I mean, you know, maybe I don't, but then how do I feed my children? You know, so like, I'm not gonna say, if you're a good person, you have to resist until you're fired. I don't think that's a reasonable demand, right? Looking for ways to resist, yes, but definitely there's a limit to that. And obviously, teachers are a part of the political landscape, and many of them actually agree with, you know, some of the views that are promoted in this way. So it's not like all teachers are opposed to them. But I do think that beyond, you know, trying to support teachers in figuring out ways to resist teachers and other professionals, I actually think that civil organizing is quite evidently, like polarization, started earlier on these issues on the right, but is catching up in progressive and other circles as well, including traditionally conservative contexts like, you know, various churches and synagogues and mosques, which are not necessarily, you know, usually operating in an effort to promote progressive vision, and still are not, for example, in regards to LGBTQ rights in many cases. But again, the small things that we can share, especially about supporting schools in this way, I think not in all cases, but in many cases, justify these collaborations. And so one thing that does give me some hope in these regards, in the most recent elections in the US, we have seen that efforts to speak blatantly against verifiable facts, for example, about who won the election or about COVID, like the previous election, and people who were promoting these more extreme views about schools, like, you know, teachers are looking to turn all of your children to be gay or trans, and, you know, as if that's like the worst thing that, you know, like, so these really like incendiary depictions of both teachers and the LGBTQ community, right? These did not catch. They were not successful electorally. And so I think the reason that they were not successful is that there was intentional organizing on the side of people who said, you know what? No, it's not a bad thing to be gay or trans, and it's not a bad thing to be a teacher. I mean, both of these things are not persuasive and are not a good electoral, or they're not politically expedient in the way that some people thought that they would be. And this, for me, you know, is an evidence that this is not just ideal theory, that it is not just Pollyannish, although to some extent it is both, but actually it can be somewhat of a roadmap for organizing around these core democratic social matters, right? Relating to knowledge and to inclusion, which can be a part of the way to lead us from here to there. So, you know, it's not the full answer, but I think it's a little bit of an effort to say political agency and particularly mobilizing around core issues through and beyond political institutions is the best path forward. That's what I've got, but I'm really hoping to hear your questions and
Thanks so much, Sigal. Thank you so much, Daniel, for this really stimulating talk. I'll just briefly introduce myself so we get a place where the questions are coming from. So I hold a professorship of inclusive practices in visual arts at teaching the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia, and also a research chair on the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism. So the work that I do is necessarily, I guess, interdisciplinary, to put it bluntly. I'm trying to draw from political theory, from religion, from legal studies, and then also trying to find a way to leverage some of the pedagogies, arts-based and also non-arts-based, so we can create spaces for pluralism. And that's something I found that kept kind of leaking out from both your comments, Daniel, and your presentation. This notion of pluralism, which we don't necessarily engage with in a theoretical way. I assign Chantal Mouffe's readings for my class, and they're quite good in as much as it gets us to think through what it means to be antagonistic, which is really how you describe the relationship between people who are on different sides of a polarized issue, versus something that's more agonistic, which we don't tend to think of carefully in the sense of how can you remain comfortable while being in dissension, in state of dissension. Practically, though, my students say, you know, we're going out into the field, we're working in communities, we're teachers, we want to be policymakers. So thanks for the theory, but what do we do? You know, what we do here. So I've been thinking, so I'll just frame this briefly and get your response to this. One of the things that we've talked about in the class and that I've been developing with some colleagues as a theory is how we can, in fact, reduce some of the, to put it bluntly, the vapidity, the narcissism, the egotism, and the immediacy that you see in the current age, whether it's fueled by social media or not, in terms of responding in a very judgmental and in a very way to people with whom you disagree with. How can you, for example, teach people to listen but not react immediately? And how do you therefore build a system whereby you go back to your silo? Because you've talked about people being in these cultures where they're respected, there's an echo chamber, they get a pat on their back because everybody thinks in the same way. If you've got a few people who are listening to the other side and they come back and say, you know what, after we're done giggling about how silly the other side is, here's what they're talking about, and here's where their knowledge bases are coming from, here's where their epistemology lies. And they may not think differently than us after listening to us, but maybe it will give us a little bit of pause for reflection. Maybe we'll choose very, very wisely or unwisely to continue to insult them. But at least you would have made that decision after a little bit of time. So I'm kind of thinking of how we can encourage this kind of discussion in classrooms, and how do you manage this? I find it difficult to manage in my own classes. One final thing as well is working with what I've been asked to label as dispossessed communities rather than marginalized or vulnerable, which really comes through in policies.
Yeah.
But dispossessed communities, they've been telling me very often that, can we just not talk about inclusion? We don't want to be included in your ways of thinking about, or in your in ways in which you're trying to exorcise yourself of your guilt. We want exclusion first. We want the means by which we can decide about what narratives we'd like to expose to you. So that's the inclusion. It necessitates a certain exclusion for a period of time, which again needs for us to step back and think through and respect the point of view that they bring. So I guess I'm trying to push a little bit in the direction of what can we tell policymakers, what can we tell our own families and children. I have two who are in university now, and you know, we have very lively discussions at home where we disagree about a lot of issues, and my kids keep telling me I'm going to cancel you. Which is good. You know, that's.
Oh, I will introduce them to my chief.
Yeah. So anyway, I just kind of just want to see how you both look at this issue. Thank you.
So, yeah, to repeat.
When questions in.
Oh, yeah.
Really a good audio capture of the question. So if you would just briefly maybe restate a couple of key points that you're responding.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so Vivek's very thoughtful question. I mean, I think the main two parts that I'm going to be able to respond to, I think one is about how we can develop habits of democratic listening. And the other one, I guess, was about the validity or lack thereof of the concept of inclusion. So let me try. Regarding the habits of listening, which I agree with you, they come down, especially in classrooms to, you know, basic pedagogical practices, right? How can I create the conditions in my classroom where people are able to comfortably listen and hear opinions that are very different from their own, particularly when these opinions sometimes reflect a position that is at worst bigoted towards one of the identities that you hold. That's sort of like going all the way over there. So, and sometimes it's not as bad, but it does get this bad. You know, I definitely had a student in my class a few years back who made a very passionate argument that women are not as smart as men and really cannot be. So, you know, I mean, even just for, you know, a class where I'm standing over here and grading your papers is a little, you know, it's not entirely smart for a guy to say that. But that's instrumentally. So regardless of that, what can I do with that? This is a person, you know, a young person. I mean, it's a college student, but it's a young person. That is what they were taught. He didn't come up with that just now as an amazing revelation, you know, listening to me and decided that probably all women are dumb, right? Maybe that's, you know, he read that, somebody told him that, he's been, you know, it's been repeated to him. That's what he believes. What can I do with that? So, of course, this is not the hardest case because I'm still standing over here and I'm comfortable and I have power in the classroom because I'm the teacher. It's worse for people sitting next to him, right? If they, you know, when a student expresses bigoted or sometimes hate-based views. And so I think really the responsibility either way is on the instructor to take on the challenge, right? And this responsibility requires, in my view, engaging with this position or perspective or misguided belief, right? This one is easy to dismiss, the one I said about the women. Oh, women have smaller brains, you know, everyone knows that. It's actually true. We're also shorter, you know, I mean, you know, we are, you know, on just overall smaller persons, you know, so, okay, let's move on, you know, not very interesting. But people have, you know, similar views, you know, across races, for example. And also they didn't invent those, right? They read them. They may have heard them from another professor, right? So you have to engage. And you probably cannot dissuade, I don't know if that's the right way of putting, like persuade the person that they are mistaken on the spot, right? But you are assured to have them keep this misguided position if you tell them you're racist, moving on, right? If you say that, you have not accomplished your main educational goal, right? Towards them. You've done something good for other people in the class. You've told other people this is inappropriate. but you didn't say why, you didn't, if it's a really like crazy view that no one else holds, you can say like, let's talk after class. But if it's like, let's say a racist view, these exist in our society, people hold them. Ignoring it in your class when it comes up, obviously you're not going to teach racist ideologies, right? But here is a person voicing them. So, okay, let's talk about that. Why do people think that without shaming the person? So you have to figure out a way. It's really hard, but you can prepare for that because you know it's going to come up at some point. People are going to voice these views. What am I going to say? Can I read about this? I have some, like in this book, sorry, that's not for the promotion, but I really wrote about this, in the book, some ideas that you can do as an instructor, like say up front at the start of class that anyone can take up 3 minutes at any point in time if they feel that, or they think that there is a position about the topic we're discussing that got no voice, right? That was not stated at all, right? Whether they hold it or not, it doesn't have to be their view. They can call for 3 minutes, right? And then they will be given the 3 minutes for this, so it's one, just one way of trying not to all be on the same page all the time, which does happen definitely in my class. What would somebody say if they disagree with me? What would be valid about their point, even if they are generally wrong, right? So trying to do that in the classroom in a structured way, I think is really important. Okay, and one quick thing about the inclusion. I mean, inclusion is a crummy word. I agree with you. It's a very popular. I put like inclusion and belonging because I don't love inclusion, but belonging is not as popular. So I like put them together. Belonging, I think, is a more effective, right? Because you can belong, on your own term rather than being included in whatever I decide is the proper way. Although I think, just one thing that I would say, Vivek, is that I think self-separation, right? It's not exclusion that I think most people would call for. It's their own terms. You can exclude me, right? Or people like me, whatever that might mean, right? But if I say, look, I'm getting up and moving over there now, it's not you excluding me, right? I'm self-separating. I need some time to think about this in my safe community of people like me, whatever that might mean again, right? And afterward, I come and tell you my thoughts and I decide what ways I belong in and things like that. So I think that has to be legitimate. I like in colleges, for example, and in schools as well, by the way, supporting identity-based groups, clubs, opportunities. Sure. Don't you want sometimes to take off your guard and just be with people like you? On some, of course, it's so natural. A lot of workplaces are doing that now, where there's something called employee resource groups or something like that. Here is a group for, women in a place where it's just 10% women in the, I mean, you don't really need it like for teachers because there's so many, but or for whatever it might be, right? So you need this safety in order to then re-engage. So I think self-separation is not contradictory to inclusion. It's a condition for it. That's my long answer.
Just very briefly, so I think that one of both points you make are very important. I agree completely with both of you about the idea that, if us sort of, privileged white guys get to say both when it is that we don't want to hear you and when it is that we want to hear you, no, you can't, then we've got a problem, right? So, we have to accept that one of the effects of decades and centuries of basically stratified societies is the people that, you know, we screwed over for so long might not want to play with us immediately, you know, on our terms, and may need. You know, I think the first point, you know, about pluralism is so important. You know, if there's a constant in my work, it has been the idea that democracy is not about everybody. It's not kumbaya. It's not about everybody sort of coming to consensus, you know, through deliberation, right? It's not Habermas or, you know, or maybe Gutman kind of, you know, deliberation. It's learning to live with difference, and even learning to live with people that you don't like, right? It's not overcoming your, you know, but well, maybe ideally it is, but, you know, it's to set ourselves the wrong kind of objective to say that in a diverse society, you know, we're going to end up, it's about compromise. It's about hammering out compromises that everybody sort of feels, you know, aren't ideal, but we can live with. Sometimes even, you know, modus vivendi, and you know, that might change over time, but it's not about, you know, sort of warm moment where I realized, oh, I was wrong about, you know, and we all kind of hug, and so I think that the Chantal move, the kind of agonistic thing, is, you know, democracy is not about coming to agree. It's living together despite our disagreement and our persistent disagreements and our persistent kind of little, you know, kind of bees in our bonnets about, you know, we are who we are, and at the end of the day, yeah, we fix ourselves the wrong kind of objectives, and the risk is that we fix ourselves, therefore, the wrong kinds of means to reach the objectives, right? And this goes back to schools, right? You know, I don't think it's the case. I think you know, for me, if schools created uncomfortable situations more often for kids, you know, that would be great, because, you know, later life is all about uncomfortable situations and learning how to deal with them. So I think that, you know, more move, less Habermas. You know, certainly, and okay, there you go. We've achieved some consensus here.
Thanks. I think we have a crooked number, which means several questions up on Zoom. Tessa,
Tessa, do you want to come over, or can people hear you when you talk like that, or do you need to come closer? Yeah.
We have an extra chair.
Yeah.
So Sivan said the comment, thank you for the presentation. I'm working on these issues here in Quebec, and although the situation is not easy, we are not yet in the same situation as you described, to heard Daniel. That being said, we are trying to develop pedagogical approaches that would guide teachers in this process and train them to do so. It is a challenge to move from reflection to practice, just to share. So that was a comment.
That's about yours.
That from me?
That's even. I just want, if it was Sivan.
That was Sivan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Sivan.
And sort of to follow up, I think I'll also pose Cindy's question, who says, thank you both for this presentation. Daniel talked about the inequalities in the education system in Quebec compared to other provinces. Can you tell us what these disparities are? How do they affect Quebec as a society and economy? And can a flawed educational system facilitate polarization?
Well, I'll say something about I mean, this is not my talk, but I mean, you know, we sort of backed into the system, which I don't think was intended to create inequality, where we, so I don't know if this is something that you know, but we fund our private schools to about 40–50%, depending on 50, you know, of their functioning, which basically means that the middle class can defect from the fully public system, right? It costs you know, $5–6,000 to send your kid to a partially funded school, which is something that is within the reach of, you know, middle class families, maybe even some lower middle class families that really, you know, tighten their belts. But basically, it means that the kind of, you know, social capital that middle class people bring to things when they're not happy about them, and, you know, yell and scream about them, is you know, we're not going to send our kids there. We're just going to, you know, pony up our $5–6,000, and so the rate of people participating in private schools in Quebec is higher than anywhere else in Canada, and you know, that's it. Basically, that's I think the root of the problem is you know, there was a reason that we did it, the partially funding. It was, you know, to relieve some of the stress on the public system, but it had a completely effect, and there's recognition of it, but there's no real political will to back out of it, because the people who benefit from them are also the people who would have the power to do something about them. So and I think it has. I don't know about polarization, and but it's certainly, Ontario, our neighbor to the west, has a public system, which I think the percentage of people in this room probably know better than me, but the percentage of people who go to private schools is much lower. And the public school system and the whole system was created by a conservative, conservative Premier Bill Davis, who, so that's the issue with, the egalitarian nature of the Quebec. I mean, I know that there are places in the States where people are paying $25,000 to send their kids to school.
Yeah.
But within the context of Canada, it is kind of, Quebec is a bit of an outlier.
Well, I mean, so no, that's great. And I mean, I think, the issue of private schooling is a little bit besides the point, in the US, because it only is just about 5% of children who are attending private schools, which are very expensive. Broadly speaking, some are cheaper, but so between 5 and 7% of children in the US, depends on how you count, attend private schools. Although part of the effort right now is to allow for people to use public monies in various ways to pay tuition in private schools, and so it doesn't go directly to the private school, but you get a voucher and you can spend it. So we are seeing some changes in this regard as well, and resulting, for example, in Arizona, in over 40% of children attending private schools as a result. So, but okay. All of this really depends on your definition. So I can't, private and charter and
Sure.
public. So I'm putting all of this comment aside. I think economic inequities are definitely a driver in polarization. There is no question in my mind that it's an important contributing factor to polarization. And it's clear to me that a lot of schools, definitely in the US, and as you're saying here in Quebec as well, are segregated across class lines, right? So socioeconomic status really is a predictor of which school you're going to attend. And oftentimes the quality of education that you are going to get measured by things like, is your teacher qualified to teach this class, or does your school have heating if needed, or cooling, or do you have textbooks, all the way down to, what are your chances to graduate from this school, right? So your socioeconomic status is a good predictor for the distinctions in the answers to all of these questions. And this does feed into polarization. So, and nothing that I said here touches on that, right? Whatever, if we do everything I said here, we haven't fixed any of this.
No.
Right. And so, so we're not fixing the whole thing for sure through this effort. I will say one thing, just to respond more directly to the second question that Tessa read. Can you really overcome polarization in a school, in a system that is so separated across class lines? I think there are ways of doing this. There are ways of talking about people who are not in the room right now, right? So there are productive ways of talking about people who are not in the room, whether they are in a different socioeconomic status, or whether they are indigenous, if there aren't, or they are of different races or linguistic communities, or whatever it might be. Or maybe you don't know if they're in the room or not, right? So you can talk about that in a way that would be, I would say, inclusive, right? A way that would be respectful of differences and representing perspectives, fairly, reading books if you're allowed to do that still, about people who are not currently maybe represented in the room, etc. So there are ways to do it. Obviously, as you, Daniel, discussed in your comment, it's better if it happens organically on the playground. Oh, how come you're eating a sandwich like this? You know, like, so if it happens just in a more natural way through encounters, it's surely more effective. But there are ways to do it otherwise. And these ways really are the ways that are the response also to the first question from Siban regarding you know, preparing teachers to do that and moving from reflection to action or to practice. You know, these are not, you know, is insufficient to read it in books. So, but we know that about pre-service teaching anyways. I mean, you've got to do student teaching, you've got to practice to do simulations, you know, to prepare for these various unknowns. And you've got to be supported in doing that, right? I mean, that's why, you know, the way that publicly we treat teachers is so central to any of these solutions.
Yes, you talked a bit about limits to resistance, and then you talked about compromise to difference. But I'd like to shift the discussion a little bit to think about actually the argument for the necessity and an absolute need for polarization. I'm thinking about circumstances like political systems of war. When a political system has murdered my child or my mother or someone like that, I think there's a real absolute need for polarization, and to have polarization and depolarization. I don't know how to quite think about this in relation to education, but you know, there's lots to be thought about there. I'd just like to have your thoughts.
Well, so thank you for this question. I appreciate it. And these are obviously the tough materials that we are working with. So I'd like to suggest a way to think about it, both politically and educationally, right? I am uncertain if, I mean, I think what you are telling me is that, or telling us is that in a certain instances, right, of either personal harm or even a recognition of harm done to others, right? I mean, if your family has experienced a loss as a result of, you know, political forces, obviously you have a good reason to take a stand, but it's possible that I have a reason to take this stand with you, even if it's not my loss, right? So I would want to think that an unjust loss of the type that you are describing would be a cause for mobilization for other people who haven't experienced and maybe are not at risk of experiencing similar losses, right? So what you are, I think what you are describing is a more taking a clear stand in opposition and resistance, and not necessarily calling for polarization. I think, I mean, unless I misunderstood you, so I'm happy to be corrected. But I think, you know, one way to respond to an extreme and not, unfortunately, not uncommon circumstance where politics is the source of personal loss and grief and pain and risk, right? One way to account for that and to look to at least prevent, you know, maybe to look for reparations or maybe to prevent it into the future, depending on the political cause that you are reflecting on here. Maybe the way to do it is not necessarily through greater polarization. It's through clarifying the stand and trying to advance it, you know, to advance a cause. The best way that I can think of advancing a cause is a mobilizing greater support, right? So this system, is creating these injustices. What are ways that some people can resist it, oppose it, mobilize against it, demand justice? Again, either looking back at reparation, it depends on the details, right? Looking back at justice or looking forward at justice in various ways. I think in educational contexts, there is no escaping the reality that education is managed by the state and is a political institution in this sense, right? It's a public political institution in its structure. And so it's going to be very hard to embody a full rejection, even of an unjust political system through the system itself, which the schools are, an arm of, right? And so I think in this regard, schools are not the best places to accommodate this type of stand or polarized resistance, right? And so probably the best that they can do is some of the things that Vivek, reflected on a few minutes ago, figuring out ways to support habits of democracy that would enable mobilizing of this sort. But it's only given that these are, schools are an arm of the state, teachers speak for the government. They are often being paid by the government in various ways. There is a very limited way in which they can fully disavow the political system, even when it's, unjust or extremely unjust in these ways. So it's not a very satisfying answer. I just don't think schools are public schools, or there are schools that are supported by the state in various ways, are in a position to do that. But I don't know if you think differently.
I mean, yeah, no, so just, everything I say about compromise is premised on a set of conditions, which in many cases just aren't present, right? So, the willingness to compromise is premised on the idea that for all sorts of reasons, we may have, we may have more reason to continue sort of working with these people that we don't like than that we do. But in certain circumstances, so there's some kind of basic cold, let's call it cold trust or cold, but in certain conditions, those conditions aren't there, right? So, we don't get to, so, when thinking about, so when I teach in law, I teach a course called Foundations of Law sometimes, and one of the things that I do, I'm not an Indigenous person, so I don't pretend to talk about Indigenous legal theory, but one thing I do teach them is, the kinds of perspectives that are represented. I don't know if these names will ring bells outside of a law context, but I present to them two different perspectives of Indigenous scholars, one of whom is, yeah, we have to compromise. We have no choice. Here we are, John Burroughs, who, is a very prominent professor of law at, I think now the University of Toronto. He was being considered as perhaps the first Indigenous Supreme Court justice. He wasn't named. There was another Indigenous woman who was named, but a scholar who actually has left the university system entirely. He was at UVic for a while, called Tayaki Alfred, whose point is basically no. These institutions have, it's going to be maybe sometime, maybe at some point, in the future, but right now we have to, reclaim our own sovereignty, not necessarily in a political Westphalian state sense, but there's the conditions of trust with the settler state are not there. The harms that have been visited upon us by the settler state are still yielding their effects, and so for the foreseeable future, it's not about compromise or whatever. It's about, and for me, that's entirely, it's no part of the role of somebody who is in every respect sort of a white, late middle-aged, to say no, come on, come in, guys. It'll be different this time. It's like Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football. I understand if at some point Charlie Brown says, no, I'm not holding the football for you. Does that reference actually resonate with people who aren't 100 years old? It does? Good, okay.
Yeah, you're gonna sort of pick up on this. Okay.
Charlie Brown?
If I may, Daniel and Sigal, isn't there a danger in succumbing to identity politics if you take your example and put it even further?
Yeah.
In the sense that because of who you are, how you're identified, or how you identify yourself, you're taking yourself out of a conversation in which you may have a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and therefore there's a certain self-censorship which worries me. And on the other hand, I think of expectations that are placed on me as a person who's born in India but grew up all over the world. The only thing that connects me to India is cricket. I'm slightly sleepy today because I've been up watching India versus Australia till 4 a.m. last night. But that's pretty much the only thing that connects me. It's a 5-day game, it's only the first time. So, but all this to say that there's an unfair expectation that I can perhaps pick up the voice or be a spokesperson for a specific group of people identified by race, gender, whatever that may be. But also this question of why would we not want to speak to it? And I'm not saying you should. And I think that the question of giving space to communities and scholars when, in fact, when they're given that space to do so, who's speaking for the dispossessed one? Who's speaking for refugees who are dying as they're trying to cross the border here? Are human rights lawyers, in fact, do they have the kind of space that some of these indigenous communities have in our university system? It doesn't need to be answered as much as, I'm afraid of identity politics. This is precisely why.
Maybe, I mean, there's again, ideal, not ideal, in a non-ideal context, in an ideal context for sure, we're all brothers and sisters and human beings, and in a non-ideal context, I think that there's a place for identity politics. Look, when I look at, so my background is sort of diaspora Jewish, right? So my parents arrived here after the war, decimated European Jewish community, and not particularly, sort of observant Jews or anything like that, but an identity was cast upon them, and by the horrors of the war. And in a way, it's a script that they inherited without having necessarily acceded to it. So there was a strange sort of kind of so I grew up in essentially a Jewish ghetto, a Jewish enclave, amongst people who didn't. If you went down the street, are you religious? You probably get a lot of no's, right? But there was the feeling that and everybody, got up in the morning and went to work, usually somewhere where they were dealing with non-Jews, right? But the feeling was we're not ready yet for the full sort of immersion, right? That would involve not living, say, in an enclave, right? We need to feel the security of. I remember having conversations with my father about this. It just felt like this identity needed to be a place that we could return to. I'm working with a completely different. It's not completely different, actually. It's totally related. I'm working on a project with an urban planner here at McGill, Lisa Bornstein, philosopher and psychiatrist Ian Gold, and a psychiatrist called Jay Shaw, on a project on urban city life and mental health. Right now, there's some interesting data which a lot of teams across the world trying to explain about why certain kinds of mental disorders, but not others, are much more frequent in cities than they are in non-cities. And it's an interesting, juicy research question, which I got involved with this. And so one of the data that's also present, and this goes back to something we were talking about before, is that the people who are most vulnerable to so dissociative disorders or psychosis and stuff like that, like are recent arrival visible minorities who don't live in an ethnic enclave, right? And when you look at recent arrivals who are visible but who live in an ethnic enclave, the numbers go down. They're still more susceptible than, say, you know, somebody living in the countryside or whatever, but the numbers go down. And you know, there's something very intuitive about that, which is that it's protective. If you're a visible minority walking around whatever a street where you're the minority, you're constantly being aggressed or microaggressed by people looking at you askance, or you know, like you know, crossing the street when you know, whatever
Or unable to communicate with language.
whatever, a million different things, right? And the accumulation of that has measurable, you know, and you know, quantified psychic effects. So, you know, maybe there's to some degree in the radically non-ideal world that we live in, something that is necessary for at least a time about identity. Now, we shouldn't succumb to a false dichotomy, right? So going back to the example of my family, you know, it's not like they lived in an ethnic enclave in which they spent 24/7, right? They, you know, we that's where we lived, that's where the friends were, but then they'd go off. My father worked in construction, and he was, you know, working with Italian and French Canadians who he loved, right? But so there was the conversation, but there was always also the sort of felt need to have a safe harbor.
Self-separation.
Self-separation, yeah.
So there are three questions,
Oh.
I think, and I'd like to take all three of them if possible, and then maybe we will.
Right,
just
I don't know what we're, I got nothing else to do.
So let's try for the three, just hear the three questions if possible. Please.
I started to reflect about social media and then any
Yeah.
and the fact that there are actually fighting the world to live in and how to keep it, sometimes we need to things, sometimes we need to take a step back and to support the women. And all of these questions and the discussions of the conversation led me to think about education and how we can produce it and how we support it in our society.
Right.
And as a demand.
Great. Great. So one question is about emancipation and how to support it.
Mine is about just your thoughts a little bit more perhaps on academic responsibility on the part of academic freedom. There's a recent scandal at McGill that makes context of where I'm getting for this, but happened to.
Oh, do it, please.
Recently, faculty of law invited a legal scholar who present the argument that protections for transgender people should be repealed because they come into conflict with protections for women. And he does a request to put on a clock, and faculty of law said yes. Naturally, a lot of people were upset.
Right.
And the faculty of law response, and many of the discussion, the faculty of law response is, well, we have academic freedom. We have the right to put on whatever scholar we want. And my issue with that is kind of just like, well, you know, if you had invited him and like the top scholar for the opposite position invited them to be out on stage, that would already be a different thing. I don't know necessarily if that's where I want to spend my time, but it would be different.
Great.
But on the other end, you know, some of the student response is like, well, this makes me uncomfortable, which for me, I always fear because I know how easy it is to use that argument against us, which is exactly like it. It's just like anybody can say they're uncomfortable. I can be a person because I say gay people on this campus and
right. Great. Okay, that's a terrific question as well. So I'll try to respond to that. And can I take,
Yeah, I wanted to return to the term polarization and ask about the sort of empirical foundations for the use of that term. You sort of admitted early on that it's asymmetric, but it is bipartisan. And then you used the term both sides precisely once, but most of your presentation was clearly dealing with one side of that polarization. Maybe your graph would have helped to illustrate that, but how asymmetric is this polarization exactly when one side is responsible for almost all of the political violence, when one side has attacked the capital, when one side is taking over the capital of Canada, Ottawa, for 3 weeks?
Yeah. So, okay, so let me start with this one and just what I meant when I said polarization on both sides. Both sides are polarizing in their positions. That says nothing about the validity or the influence of any of their positions. What I was indicating is that we are seeing where, if I'm looking at the American example for a second, you had the one big tent, that's the Democratic Party, and another big tent, that's the Republican Party, and some significant, overlap in the sense that there were a lot of people who, in terms of their policy positions, could be either, or whose views were mostly democratic, but let's say they were opposed to abortion, which is a core democratic, or they were Republican, but they supported various welfare rights or gay marriage, equal marriage, or so you had more crossover and more overlap. Right now, you have two narrow tents where fewer positions are accepted, and with non-existent or nearly non-existent overlap between them. Now, am I worried about the positions here and here to the same extent? Not to the same extent. I'm worried about the narrowing on both sides. This is my both sides part. Now, when we look at the specifics, for example, if one side, and that's generally the conservative side, tends to be more prone to relying on limited evidence in relating to scientific claims about climate, about vaccines, I am worried about relying your policy, making policy statements that rely on untrue or unsupported arguments, right? So do I find similar things on the left? Yes, sometimes, but less significant, right? So I'm not trying to equate the two, but I'm saying in terms of the distancing, right? Started more on the right, moving away from the center and coalescing, and then is mirrored now to a slightly more limited extent on the left. So this is the empirical discussion on polarization. And the reason that I'm equating to is just the visual one, right? But the substantive, of course, there are substantive differences, and I'm not equating the positions themselves. Okay, about platforming people who hold views that some people have an argument to represent as abhorrent or unsafe or inappropriate in various ways, including views such as repealing rights for trans folks and other, people who represent views, as I noted before, that suggest that different races have different capacities intellectually, so you suggested in your remark or question that maybe it would have been better if we had people representing two opposing views on this. And I want to suggest that I'm not even sure that's satisfying the kind of concern that you are raising. There is a case in, let's see if I can click through and find it. There is a case in Probably not. See, I have tons of graphs. No, I don't have it here. This is the polarization thing, just for the previous question. If you want to take a look, that's my picture. There was a case at the Yale Law School, not, in this past fall, where they did invite speakers on both sides of this same issue, right? One speaker who supported the laws right now that are forbidding treatment for young trans folks, and another person who who is opposed to these laws and therefore is supportive of especially the younger trans community, but the trans community generally. And they experienced a similar disruption, and basically the event did not go forward, as I understand. Similarly ended up happening here. But so it doesn't resolve necessarily the whole issue. Oh, did I do it wrong? Oh, thank you. But I do want to agree with you that the context and the details really matter. I know that commonly it is said in English that the devil is in the details. In Hebrew, God is in the details. So I think that's who we can find there. And here is a case for you. A few years back, at Bard College, a speaker was invited who was a neo-Nazi, member of a political group, political party in Europe, an elected official who is a neo-Nazi. He actually espouses, Nazi views. To speak at a conference at Bard College. And there was a lot of consternation over whether this was appropriate to platform this view, to give voice to this position. And I personally actually, coming from, as both of your speakers here, from a Jewish background who has experienced significant losses during the Holocaust, I supported inviting him. And the reason that I supported it was the context and the format, just like you said. This was not a required event. So if it's harmful to you or you cannot handle it, you can avoid it, especially as a student. And the purpose of the event, and here might lie a difference, the purpose of the event was to expose the audience who is willing to listen to views that are currently on the rise in Europe, for the purpose of trying to understand the political landscape and, develop views about how to handle that. Are anti-trans views common, or at least somewhat prevalent in some sections or some communities within Canadian society? If so, right, I actually don't know, but I suppose they are. If so, then it might make sense to listen to these views if the context is one, like, for example, with my neo-Nazi case, the person did not receive the microphone and go to pontificate like I did just now for 40 minutes, right? What happened was that they were interviewed by a person who was familiar with the context in which they operate and was able to raise questions and concerns and really to frame the issue in its historical context, in its current political context. So not challenging the person. I mean, people knew he was a neo-Nazi, so it's not, and he's not offended if you say, right? So the point really was an effort to understand this view for an educational purpose in a non-mandatory context. I thought that was useful because if I'm not listening to this guy, he's still out there. He was elected and he has power, and his views, represent, I don't know what, 10%, whichever percent. I need to figure out the way to understand what he's saying, not to be persuaded, but to address it, to find my way through a world where this person is an elected official. Go ahead.
So I'm in the faculty of law, by the way. So is this being recorded? Is it being recorded? I have
So
nothing to,
maybe.
I have nothing
No.
to say. No, so I think they're really, I think the devil or God being in the details, what Sigal said is absolutely correct. And to some degree, what the distinctions that she draws are important ones. I think that there's a big difference. This could be a whole other event between freedom of speech and academic freedom, right? And we tend to align the two, and they're different. And academic freedom is about the freedom to do academic work, but it's not the freedom to do non-academic work, right? And I think that there's something that is happening, and I think it's happening on the left and on the right as well, right? In this case, we had, I mean, you know, it was clear for anybody who looked a little bit at what, you know, the bio and stuff, that he was coming as an advocate, as a kind of a militant, rather than as somebody who's going to present dispassionate research, right? And I think that changes what is going on. And then the way in which, so I think the mistake was presenting it as the one, whereas it was the other. Now it's a subtle difference because, you know, all of our research when we're working in, you know, if we're not working in theoretical physics, right, and even maybe there, you know, our research has values in it, and it leads to conclusions that have maybe policy implications. So there's a subtle line,
But
and there's a line, and you know, I think that there's a difference between the guy that, you know, if we had brought in a politician who was advocating for legislation in the National Assembly, whatever, then I think all of the remarks that Sigal made would have applied. You know, it's important for citizens to know. But I think in this case, it was this very, and I think it's something that it's one of the main challenges that we have in supporting academic freedom, while recognizing that academic freedom is academic freedom. It's not the freedom to be able to leverage your, you know, the fact that you put PhD next to your name in order to engage in political advocacy. Again, subtle line, but I think it's so important that we at least try to identify it and make sure that I'm going to use the word police, that we police it a little bit. So police in the, and I think that, you know, I mean, there, you know, I can give you sort of very sort of almost biographical reasons why it didn't get policed in this particular case, and they're unfortunate, but they're not demonic, you know. But it's one of the big challenges that we have to face as universities. I mean, you know, think of the most famous Canadian academic these days, right? Is who? Jordan Peterson, exactly, right?
He's retired now.
Is he retired?
Yes.
Oh, did he?
He left the university, but yeah,
Oh,
still is Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. So, you know, when Jordan Peterson is doing, you know, that's the leveraging of the PhD. You know, I mean, his PhD is in what is it?
Psychology.
But like Jungian psychology, like it's something fairly abstruse, no?
Who knows?
Who knows?
But he is using his position. Right.
But the reason why we bring up academic freedom versus academic responsibility is that the thing that interests me there is that there's kind of a postmodern argument there. Like academic freedom is a bit that position that like we create knowledge and then have power. And academic responsibility is kind of a recognition that power does shape that. That after, you know, if McGill uses its clout indiscriminately, that means that whoever has spoken there can then say, I spoke.
Right. And that's the problem of the platform, right? You are giving a platform, and in this way, you are validating somebody's position.
By the way, just as a matter of anecdote, you know, I didn't know, you know, it's not my field, you know, I didn't know, but after the event, I kind of, you know, I went on a Google thing, and let me tell you, he rode the thing that happened at McGill for all that it was worth, right? Subsequently, and to the point where you sometimes want, you know, it was like, you know, was he hoping that this would happen? Because he wouldn't have got, I mean, the room that it was, I don't know if you were there, the room that it was in is much smaller than this room, right? Maybe holds 20, 25 people max, right? You're not going to get any big media from having given a talk to,
I'm here for the conversation.
Your view is not gonna get, it's not gonna get Radio Canada and the CBC if you're in.
Part- Partly it's a platform that you can use
Yeah,
to
yeah,
to
yeah.
expand.
And.
Yeah, you went on prime time UK television.
Yeah.
And you returned.
That's right.
I'm going
That's
to
right.
speak
That's
and
right.
to finish the whole conversation along with you, and this was very satisfying to me, even though it's not gonna get me a similar speaking engagement on TV. But I just want to say, I know I owe you an answer, so I'll do it later because we're out of time, and I really just want to appreciate both the questions and the examples and the opportunity to engage with all of you. So thank you so much.